Welcome to the presentation on Lockout Tagout presented by the Motor Safety Association. An introduction to today's presentation on Lockout Tagout is we will discuss and define what is Lockout Tagout. We'll look at the provincial health and safety regulations in Western Canada for Lockout Tagout as well as the CSA standard. We'll look at some various samples of Lockout Tagout devices and a sample Lockout Tagout procedure. We will look at some hazard alerts for people who have been injured due to not utilizing a Lockout Tagout program, and we will look at some various questions throughout the presentation as well. And as we go through the presentation, you'll see that I've abbreviated Lockout Tagout, LOTO, so I've done that to go short form when we itemize Lockout Tagout instead of spelling it out for each slide that we cover. So as we see, there are various keys on this slide. I know in the agricultural industry, most of these keys will fit from the machines from, say, 1975 to 1996. So we do see an issue when it comes to Lockout Tagout because this one key will start that tractor or start that combine or those pieces of powered mobile equipment because they use the same ignition. So another technician can start up and power up a powered mobile equipment's device because he or she has the same key on their key ring. So that's why it's very important to have a Lockout Tagout procedure in place, because you don't want someone starting up a piece of equipment that another technician is working on. So what is Lockout Tagout? Well, Lockout Tagout is the term used to identify and positively secure a device from being able to energize a system. So you can see this here picture with Homer and Lenny. They have this fan switch is locked out and there's a device on it with the locks. So I'm not sure what Homer's up to there, but what this defining is the Lockout Tagout as a means of securing a device so that it cannot be energized in the system. When do we lock out? There's some confusion as to when exactly do I start with the lockout of a piece of equipment. Well, general rules, when we look at machinery or tools, or in this situation on the diagram, electrical panels, if you are going to be working with that piece of equipment, say for example the guarding is removed or bypassed, or your body can come into contact with the working parts of it during service or maintenance, then the lockout must be done. So in general, that's pretty much most times that you're going to be working with these pieces of equipment if your guarding is removed. It is important to lock it out before you begin servicing or maintenance because you don't want that unexpected release of energy that's stored that could cause an injury. So what is the purpose of Lockout Tagout? It's to ensure that the safety of employees when they are working around equipment, machinery, and tools, such as if they're doing a repair, maintenance, installation, removal of attachments or components to the equipment. So we have to be aware of purpose of why we're doing this lockout is because we want to protect our workers from that release of stored energy. I'm going to use an example of stored energy if you're familiar with the vehicles or powered mobile equipment. So on their cooling system, we drive the piece of equipment for some time and the radiator gets quite hot. So if we were to all of a sudden take the radiator cap off, we're going to have it's going to bubble over and there's going to be a lot of steam and the heat's released. So that is basically an example of stored energy, even though if we wait till the machine cools down before we have to work on the cooling system, that's the proper procedure. But if this is stored energy, people may not be aware that it's stored and pressurized. And that's what the purpose of Lockout Tagout is. There's a lot of situations where we have stored energy in raised loads or in hydraulics. So we have to be aware of these items have stored energy that could be released. And we want to be sure that it is only released when it is safe to be released, not in the event of causing an injury to a worker. So what if I can't lock it out? A lot of times there's simplicity. There's a process that we can use to put a lock box or a lock on a device to lock out a piece of equipment or a tool. But in some situations, it's as simple as just putting a lock on. For example, you may not have a lock, or the device may not be lockable. So what you could also do is tag it out by using a cable tie strap. And if you do that, you want to utilize a cable tie strap and a tag so that the position of the tag is obvious for anyone attempting to operate the equipment. So if we are looking at a piece of powered mobile equipment, we've got a big tag on the door of the cab, on the steering wheel. The tag should have the name and date of the person who displayed the tag, and it should also say warning, do not start or do not operate. The preferred method, of course, is to lock it out. And there are some means that we'll discuss throughout the presentation. We'll look at some lockout devices that you can utilize, because there is a universal device that you could use for some of those harder to lock out machines. So we'll get into that as we look at some examples in the presentation. So there are various types of sources of energy that we have to be aware of. Sometimes when people refer to lockout, tagout, they're thinking about electricity or electrical as their main component as a source of stored energy, but there's really a lot more to it. Look at our hydraulic systems. We've got accumulators, cylinders, we have stored pressure, and there's thermal energy, mechanical, pneumatic through air and chemical and gravity. These are all sources of energy that our purpose is to lock these out so that the worker cannot be hurt from these sources of stored energy in the workplace. And as we talk about those items, it is the law. It is regulated that there is precautions and legislation in place to support the lockout, tagout within the provinces of Western Canada that I speak to in this presentation, as well as a CSA standard. So I'm going to itemize each of those. Let's start in British Columbia. Regulation 10. When lockout is required, if the machinery or equipment is shut down for maintenance, no work may be done until all parts and attachments have been secured against inadvertent movement, where the work will expose workers to energy sources, the hazard has been effectively controlled, and the energy isolating devices has been locked out as required by this part. So the British Columbia regulation clearly itemizes when lockout is required. Similar regulation in Saskatchewan or in Alberta, locking the isolation by ensuring that the energy isolating device and all relevant components are physically secured to prevent the release of energy. That could cause inadvertent movement to activation. Access to the securing device must be properly managed. So they're speaking to a lockout tagout program and securing and locking out the energy isolating devices. Same thing in Saskatchewan. The regulation is similar to the previous two, but what's different about the Saskatchewan regulation is the first part talks about machines, and the second part speaks specifically to power tools. So before a worker undertakes the maintenance, repair, test, or adjustment of a power tool, an employer shall ensure that the energy source has been isolated from the power tool and residual energy is dissipated. So it not only speaks to machinery and equipment in subsection 1, in section 2 it speaks to power tools. So that's something to be aware of as well as you evolve through your lockout tagout program. And the regulation is much the same in Manitoba. No workers to perform work on a machine that is serviced, repaired, tested, cleaned, maintained, or adjusted until the machine has come to a complete stop and the worker performing work on the machine has locked out the machinery. So there you go. As you can see, each of the provinces within Western Canada has specific health and safety regulations pertinent to lockout, tagout. If that wasn't enough, there's also a CSA standard for Canada for lockout, tagout. That standard is Z460-05 R2010. And some of the key highlights of that CSA standard is that it says it requires a written program and lockout procedures, including the shutdown and lockout of equipment, and that employees need to be trained in what their role is in the lockout tagout program, and you have to administer and manage that maintenance program and to inspect to ensure that your lockout tagout program is working. So as you can see, amongst Western Canada as well as the CSA standard, there is clear guidelines for lockout tagout. But what happens when we have to remove these tags once they've been in place? Well, what you want to do is you want to ensure that you check for scene safety. You want to make sure that if I were to take this lock or tag off of the piece of equipment, that the machine isn't going to move or release stored energy. So you want to ensure that the scene is safe. Then you want to make sure that the lock or tag is removed by the person who attached it, and notify the technicians or co-workers around you that the machine has been removed, the locks or tags from it. There are some exceptions to point number 2. You may have to get the service manager or the supervisor or a foreman in some situations under special circumstances only to remove those locks or tags. Say, for example, a worker is sick for an extended period of time and another technician has completed the work order. So that would be an example of when you would want to have someone else remove that lock for the device if they weren't the person who locked it out. Let's look at some lockout, tagout devices that we've seen utilized amongst the industry. Basically, a lockout, tagout device is any device that either has a lock or a positive means of securing and preventing the energization of that machine or equipment or tool. So as you can see on this picture, here is a lock with a tag on a valve. So that's an example of a device. And when you're not using devices, there's also a lockout, tagout center that you could store the devices in. So that's just featured on the slide. The next slides that we will see showcase various lockout, tagout examples of products. The Motor Safety Association does not particularly promote or endorse any specific manufacturer of any of these items featured in the next slides. They are just examples that you can utilize as what products are available. So feel free to research whatever products on your own that you wish to utilize in your locations. So I spoke about a lockout, tagout center. This is something that you want to keep in a clean area that's secure, sometimes the service manager's office or the hallway near his office or her office. And this allows you to see which locks are out and which people are utilizing them, and that they can be returned there when they're not in use. It's also a good resource to keep your tags. Another way to get your tags is tags by the roll. You can order a bulk roll of tags, and you can fill them out with the name and department of the person who's utilizing them. So that seems to work out as well for an option. This here is an example of a basic single lockout, tagout device. This is as simple and as basic as it comes. It's just a labeled padlock indicating it's locked out. As well, it has the tag on the lock. So this allows for the servicing person who will be working on that machine to apply it to his or her machine that they're working on. This example includes a lock and a tag. So that is basically a basic example of a single lockout device. But what happens when you have 2 or more people working on a machine? In that situation, each technician shall place his or her own lockout or tagout device on that machine as well. And if there are some limitations, because you may not be able to put a few locks or tags onto a machine, you would use this here device called the hasp. And what this hasp does, it allows you to allow multiple locks when you have more than 2 people working on a machine. Here's a better picture of a multi-person locking hasp. And an interesting fact about this is when you close the hasp, the upper right-hand location of the hasp is usually where the primary person installs his or her lock. So this allows the person to, whoever's the primary or lead on that project, to put his or her lock in that location. So that's kind of how the multi-person locking hasp is outlined. As well as when it comes to powered mobile equipment, this here is a device that you can utilize. It's basically a steering wheel cover, and there's an eyelet on this tarp where you would put your lock and tag on that device. So that's one way of doing it, but I like to take that one step further and take the ignition keys for this machine and also include it in that locking device so that you have so no one can start into that. But in addition to that, we'll speak of the presentation about specific procedures, because what should be done is you want to disconnect and isolate the power supply by removing the battery cable and installing a lock box. So this picture doesn't tell the whole story. It shows an example of the product of covering the steering wheel with the signage and locking it, but there is a complete procedure for the power disconnect as well, which we'll feature in the presentation. As mentioned before, the lockout tagout ID tags by the roll. You can also order ones that are personalized. You can have the worker's name and photograph right onto the lockout tag so we know who's utilizing it. Sometimes with people who may have language barriers, if their English is a second language, they may not be able to read John Smith, but they'd be able to recognize the picture on the tag. So that works quite well also. And it also adds that human touch that we're working with real people when we see their pictures and names on these tags. This is an example of locking out acetylene, oxygen, or cutting torches. This basically prevents unauthorized use of these torches, and it ensures that only trained operators are utilizing these products. So that works quite well in minimizing who accesses these pieces of equipment. It also works well for minimizing waste, because only the trained operators will be using these in situations when you want them to be using them. Here's an example of lock boxes. You can utilize lock boxes like this to lock out battery cable ends or solenoid ends, depending where you disconnect your powered mobile equipment, or in this situation on the pictured, electrical cord ends. So this works quite well. You put your cord end or cable end into the box, you close it, and you insert your lock and tag onto it. So this here device can be used for various applications where you would slide a cable into it and lock the box. Here's an example of locking out an electrical panel box. This is primarily used by contractors or electricians, but your staff need to be aware of that. If they're trying to use a chop saw in their dealership and they see that they try to saw and the saw is not working, first thing they do is go to the breaker box and they see the strap on it. They're going to realize, okay, the power has been shut down by a contractor or electrician, and they locked out the box. Opposed to if that wasn't there, they're going to open up that box, flip on the breaker, and could cause injury to someone else. So that's why it's important that if you do have contractors or electricians, that they utilize the lockout tagout equipment. There's also a device in place for electrical switches. Sometimes you may have a piece of equipment that is wired directly to a switch, and this would prevent people from turning it on, but you can lock it out and tag it out right at the switch panel. Spoke of earlier, if there is an electrician or contractor at your location, you want to exchange that necessary lockout tagout information with them, so that if they are using a strap on the box, so people know about it, what's your lockout tagout equipment information at your business, so that people can swap the information so that everyone involved is confirmed and understanding of what their roles are. Here's an example of locking out trailering equipment. So if I'm trying to, if I'm working on this trailer or piece of equipment, and I have perhaps maybe removed a leaf spring on it, and someone didn't realize that, and they hooked onto it and pulled it away, they're going to cause some damage to the axles on that trailer. So this here is a device that you can install so that someone cannot pull it away if you are underneath fixing it or if it's been taken apart. And it also works well in preventing theft. This is an example of a glad hand trailer lockout. And this keeps your trailer secure, especially when it's being loaded, unloaded, stored, or worked on. And I'd like to commend the Western Canadian Tire Dealers Association, their safety committee, have worked diligently on coming up with some processes, and this was one of the processes that they have been utilizing. So if they're working on a tractor trailer or semi-unit, if they're repairing the tires or anything in that regards, if they're under the trailer, that way people can't start driving away with the technicians under them. So this is a device that basically locks it goes onto the emergency brake connection and limits the movement of that trailer. So that works very well in securing it. This here device is called a Lockout cinch hasp. And as I spoke of earlier in the presentation, in some situations where there may be limitations when you're trying to lock out a device because you may not be able to put a lock on it. This here is a universal device that allows you to run the cable through the device you're trying to lock out. So in some of those harder to lock out devices, a tool like this works quite well because you run the cable through the device you want to lock out, you twist the hasp, and then you can insert your padlocks through these holes once the holes are lined up. So you would lock it out in the same way. As mentioned, it does work quite well because it is so universal. And this is an example of an air tool lockout. This prevents connecting to a compressed air line source, so a person does not use the air tool until it is safe to do so. So there's an example of one of those. And speaking of tools, what procedure do we have in place if you were to lock out or take out your tools within your location? For example, faulty tools, they need to be removed from service and tagged out immediately. As soon as you notice that this tool isn't safe to use, it needs to be removed from service and tagged out. The faulty tool should then be reported to the foreman or service manager, and they can either have that tool repaired or replaced. Just be sure that you don't save faulty tools for parts or that you give them away because they are faulty. And in those situations, you need to have a procedure in place when it comes to tools. For example, grinders, drill presses, jacks, those sorts of things or any sort of tooling, you want to look at it having a procedure in place for taking it out and having it repaired or replaced. Now that we've looked at some various lockouts, tagout devices and explained the legislation, I'm going to give you a sample procedure that you can utilize when it comes to lockouts, tagout. We see that there are provincial regulations in place, and I know some dealerships already in groups have a great lockout, tagout program in place. And I encourage you guys to share that amongst yourselves, what you're doing at your dealership for lockout, tagout. And we can help out as well with various examples. I'm going to give you just a basic procedure example of lockout, tagout. So firstly, if the machine is operating, shut it down by your normal stopping procedures. If you have to press the clutch, put it into park, turn off the fuel, the stop button, the key, however you normally turn off that piece of equipment, that's what you would want to do in the first step. Then you're going to tell the technicians or employees around you that I'm going to be locking out or tagging out this piece of equipment. At that point, if there's any stored energy, such as that could be found in springs, elevated front-end loaders, hydraulic systems, air pressures, etc., those must be dissipated or drained off to make sure that that stored energy has been released. For example, when it comes to this hydraulic cylinder, so picture this as a front-end loader, and say you have to leave this loader elevated to raise the hood on this piece of equipment you're working on. So you would use these cylinder locks. It's a lock that would come onto the cylinder shaft. You would then lower the cylinder shaft to ensure that the lock is secure and working. So those would be examples of releasing that stored energy. At that point, you would install your locking devices, whether it be that cylinder lock that I showed, if it's the energy isolating device, removing that power supply, taking out on the steering wheel cover, all those devices that we looked at, you would want to, at that point, install those on the piece of equipment that you are working on. After ensuring that no workers are exposed and the scene is safe, try starting that piece of equipment. Try moving those hydraulic levers. You will find, hopefully, that nothing is going to happen. If you did those previous steps correctly, nothing will happen. So that's why you do this exercise, to ensure that there is no stored energy in the electrical or the hydraulic systems. And then if you do, once you've done this step, be sure to return those hydraulic levers and switches to the neutral position, because if you tried these levers, you make sure that you put them back, because once you reverse the process and once you've done working on your piece of equipment, you want to ensure that those levers are in the correct position, so that when you go to startup, that you're not having to engage something else. At this point, and only at this point, the equipment is now locked out or tagged out. So that's a basic 6-step procedure that you can utilize in your location when it comes to lockout, tagout. Let's speak briefly about some various situations where people have been injured or fined due to not utilizing a lockout, tagout program. This is one in British Columbia where a 39-year-old worker lost an eye. This worker was injured while clearing sawdust from around a saw using an air hose with a 4-foot aluminum pipe nozzle extension. The saw was not shut down, and the worker struck the saw with the pipe, causing the pipe to break. A piece of the pipe struck the worker in the face. The worker lost an eye as a result of the injury. The worker did not shut down and lock out the saw and was not wearing personal protective equipment. So there's one example. Here's one in the province of Manitoba, and this is a situation where the Provincial Occupational Health and Safety issued an improvement order in June of 2013 for this company called North Star Manufacturing. And what happened was they were fined $2,500 because a program to lock out machinery or render it inoperative when the machine is serviced, repaired, tested, cleaned, maintained, or adjusted has not been implemented. So they were fined because they did not have a lockout, tagout program in place. So there's an example of a situation where a business was fined because they did not have a program in place. A little further east to Ontario, the company of Thyssen Krupp Industrial Service, they were fined $160,000, as well as their supervisor was also fined $11,000 in the same incident dating back to 2009. Where an electrical worker was removing conductors from an electrical panel. A bare conductor touched the side of the electrical panel, causing an arc flash. The worker sustained serious burns, electrical burns. The Ministry of Labor's investigation found that the panel was not disconnected from the power source, locked out, or tagged out before the work started. And last example, this one was from New Jersey. OSHA has cited American Built Right Incorporated for a health and safety violation. This goes back to 2011, following the death of a worker who was crushed in a coating machine while attempting to clear a jam. The company failed to use an energy control, lock, out, or tagout system, and prior to allowing the employee to enter the machine's danger area. The proposed penalties total $51,300. This here situation is still in the courts and has not been resolved, so that number could fluctuate. But I want you to think about all of these examples we spoke about. The worker who was injured, blowing off sawdust from a piece of equipment that was turning. The company that did not have a lockout, tagout program in place. And what about your location? And could any of these affect you? Say, for example, this one, the person trying to clear out a machine that was still running. Look in your business and what practices you have in place. Are you ever in one of these situations where someone could fall or be injured into a moving machine? Or do you have a lockout, tagout program in place? These examples are facts. They have happened. So if they've happened in the past, they could unfortunately happen again. So we're here to present this information on lockout, tagout, so you can work in prevention and prevent that from happening in your location by going through the necessary precautions. Now, if you do require more training or information on lockout tagout, there's a link on our website to a program called Wsit, and they offer 25 different health and safety courses for one price, and lockout tagout is one of those courses. So with that, thank you for taking the time to join us for this presentation on lockout tagout. Our website that was featured in the presentation, www.motorsafety.ca, if you wish to contact us for more information. Thank you.